Hey folks, I'm JC from One Shot Adventures, and today I'm going to talk about GURPS. Because after 20 years, GURPS just got a brand new version. And I'm going to do a full review of this huge volume that is designed to let gamers play in virtually any genre in any time period. But first, some background on me. I'm a big fan of RPGs, and I've been playing since I was a kid. I started out with the red box version of Dungeons & Dragons, and then in a couple years discovered GURPS, which came out in the mid-80s. I was attracted to it because it felt more realistic than D&D. A single arrow could easily kill a hero in this game, and it let me play in other worlds beyond just fantasy. And while GURPS would become a mainstay at my table, I became an RPG omnivore over the decades. I love Call of Cthulhu, and I've run some of its biggest campaigns like Beyond the Mountains of Madness. I'm a huge fan of dungeon crawl classics and its gonzo, crazy fantasy adventures and insane magic system. I've run Shadowdark, Pendragon, In Nomine, Traveler, Vampire, and the D6 system, and I like them all. I'm not the gamer that will tell you that just because GURPS, which was designed to play in any genre, is the best choice for everything. I personally like it because it's so flexible and it lets me run new games with my group without having to teach them new rules every time. But I'll also acknowledge that it has its own disadvantages and quirks. But let's dive into the new GURPS Fourth Edition Revised. First off, this is a modest revision. It's not a brand new 5th edition. There are no real rules changes here. It combines the two existing basic books, characters and campaigns, so you get everything you need in a single volume now. Amazingly, it retains the same page numbers as the classic 4th edition, which is very handy as it makes it fully compatible with hundreds of supplements. The book lightly updates some of the wording and phrasing, modernizing some out-of-date language, clarifying some rules, and adding some GM tips here and there throughout the book. It changes out most of the art for newer pieces and updates the layout from 3-column format to 2-column format, which I find just makes the book so much more readable, especially on tablets and screens. It also includes dozens of pages of new content across 4 addendum sections spread throughout the book, sort of shoved in haphazardly thanks to the way 2 books combine into one. And these addendums pull some of the best and most useful expansion material from various supplements over the past 2 decades. GURPS is a big game system, and it would take many videos to do it full justice. So what I'm going to do today is walk through the book and spend about half the time talking about the basic GURPS systems for newer players who might be interested in GURPS, and the other half of the time talking about the new material added to this revision. GURPS stands for the Generic Universal Roleplaying System. It was named that way because Steve Jackson said he couldn't come up with a better name. It's been around since the 80s in mostly the same form. It was designed to let gamers play in various genres without a lot of rules changes, so you can play in a hardcore science fiction game one day, a fantasy game the next, or you can go crazy and create your own world that mashes together aliens, magic powers, and time travel. You can do this all with this one book. GURPS is based on what I call heroic realism, which means that mostly everything behaves like it would in the real world. An arrow to the face is a bad news for anyone in this game. Guns do far more damage than swords, automatic weapons are scary as hell, and armor behaves mostly like it should. In my own experience, GURPS' sweet spot is somewhere between Game of Thrones grittiness and John Wick heroism, and while I wouldn't use it for crazy cinematic superheroes, I know there's fans out there who would fight me for that and say that they've made that work, and I probably believe them. The basic mechanic of GURPS is a 3d6 roll-under system. This makes GURPS pretty intuitive for new players. For example, if you have an IQ of 12 and are trying to decipher a puzzle, just roll 3 6-sided dice and try to roll under a 12. If you have a first aid skill of 9, well, you just need to roll a 9 or under. The more you roll under your skill, the better the result. Generally, a roll of 3 or 4 is a critical success, and generally a roll of 17 or 18 is a critical failure. The bell curve of the 3d6 system makes it feel more predictable than other games. It's less swingy than rolling a d20, and high-skill characters will hardly fail until they're in very tough situations. The complexity of GURPS comes from its many, many modifiers and exceptions. For example, firing a pistol requires a guns roll. You roll 3d6, try to roll under your gun skill. Let's say I'm a crack shot with a skill of 14. But now I apply range, which has a very granular table in GURPS, so I say my target is 10 yards away, so that's a -4. But I'm braced up against the wall for a +1. But it's sunset, so that's another -1. And now I'm going to try to shoot the bad guy in the leg for another -2. But I aim for a turn, which adds my pistol's accuracy of +2, so you do all that math, and it's a total of -4 to my hit roll, so now I need a 10 or less now. Now, that's rules as written, and I can mostly do that from memory after years and years of playing, but you can see how all of those modifiers might boggle newer players and GMs. It's hard to keep track of all of them, and you really don't want to pull out a 600-page book and flip back and forth to figure out what you need to hit a bad guy with your pistol. But you can also play GURPS hand-waving away a lot of that complexity. A GM could easily say, yeah, it's a tough shot, let's say -5 to hit, and keep the game moving. With GURPS, only take on the complexity that you and your players really want. I recently ran a behind enemy lines World War II military game, and my group used most of those gritty modifiers because we wanted it to feel tactical and real. But when I ran my 1960s spy game at Gen Con, I hand-waved away most of that complexity just to keep the game feeling faster paced and more like the cinematic James Bond experience I wanted. But the beauty of GURPS is once you explain to somebody that 3d6 mechanic and hand them a character sheet, well, players can mostly just play the game without rules lookups. For most genres, a GURPS character sheet is actually less complicated than a Pathfinder or D&D character sheet. GURPS has extensive rules for social situations, environmental hazards, athletics, and pretty much anything else you can imagine. It's all included in this book. If you want to know how free-falling in a radiation zone and zero gravity affects your combat rules, this book has you covered. Hey, wait a second. What do you mean I'm going to get hemophilia and die painfully over the next 3 days? I really should have taken vac suit skill. Combat is pretty straightforward in GURPS, at least until you add on all the optional rules. You simply roll under your combat skill to hit your opponent. And your opponent usually gets a defense roll, like a dodge or parry, to cancel that attack. There's several damage modifiers for weapons, so axes are more effective than clubs, and impaling and piercing damage can be very deadly if they penetrate your armor. Like other RPGs, characters in GURPS have hit points, usually 10 or 12 for a typical person, and when they run out, well, they have to make a health roll to stay conscious. And when they reach negative health, you have to make another health roll to stay alive. I always liked this death mechanic. As you get injured, your hero is clinging on turn by turn, and no one really knows what's going to happen. There are options for playing combat out on a hex grid or a theater of the mind, and I often use both depending on the combat and the genre and the game I'm running. Combat plays out blow by blow, second by second, which requires some GM finesse to get it to feel right when combatants aren't just beating on each other. Sometimes if somebody wants to pull off a more complicated or cinematic move, GMs have to kind of compress and expand time to make that work. But the game does allow for a lot of tactics on each turn if players want. There are rules for letting you throw a feint on one turn, lower somebody's defenses, and then give up your own defenses to all out attack the foe for bonus damage on the next turn. You have things like deceptive attacks, which can overwhelm people's parries. I like that the tactical options are pretty much unconnected to your character, so your wizard can all out attack to try to thrust his staff into an orc's eye, just as easily as a warrior. He's got that option too. He'll probably be worse at it, but he can still do it.
Hold still. All out deceptive attack. Oh yeah, I totally missed, guys. You do it.
As a result, GURPS combat is very visceral. Equipment and skill matter pretty much equally. Maybe equipment gets the edge, and getting injured really hurts. If there's one criticism of GURPS combat, is that it will play out mostly realistically. a rogue with 2 daggers, will be very disappointed when he attacks a knight in plate mail. Ignoring cover in a gunfight will likely end up with you bleeding out in just a couple of seconds. Sometimes you'll see posts on Reddit like, I want to make a character who uses a whip, and I want him to be just as good as my buddy, the strong dwarf with the 2-handed axe.
A whip! A whip to compare to my 2-die +3 cutting axe. You'll be playing the wrong game, boy. Why don't you go back to D&D Beyond and see if you can go monetize that whip there instead? Oh, whip!
GURPS is famous and infamous for its deep and customizable character creation system, one that lets players create nearly any character concept they have with just this basic set. It's a point-buy system, so you spend points, usually about 150, on your core attributes, strength, dex, IQ, health, skills, and advantages, which are like special abilities, things like luck, which gives you rerolls throughout the game, or combat reflexes, or attractiveness, or having a famous reputation. And because it's meant to be universal, there are tons of advantages and skills to pick from, hundreds. This does make it very difficult for new players to figure out the game and create a character unless they get a lot of GM guidance. So for example, let's say I want to create Mr. Spock. Well, of course you have to give him a really high IQ and then, put other points into his strength and dexterity as you'd see fit. You have to make sure you have his many science skills and his electronics operations skills, and remember that he knows how to pilot a starship and that he's pretty good at brawling. And then you have to think about modeling his Vulcan nerve pinch.
My nerve pinch does not appear to be working. I must have misconfigured my afflictions, enhancements, and limitations.
And figure out what other advantages he might have. You can easily miss something, especially in that skill list. I've run games before where my players have fallen off boats, and then when I ask them to make swimming rolls, well, they all forgot to take that skill. And that's awkward, but that does happen a lot in GURPS unless you've played it a lot. Some GURPS books offer templates for players, which gives them a kind of an archetype and then makes them make some choices to build the character so they don't forget anything. But there's just not a ton of them in the basic set, and so you have to kind of know where to look to find them, and they're not even available for every genre. So I wish there was more here for that, but we'd have to wait for a 5th edition to get that. Characters can also take disadvantages, which gives players points back. Some of these are psychological flaws like stubbornness or overconfidence or having no sense of humor. And then there's physical disadvantages like missing a hand, having bad eyesight, or being really ugly. The more limiting the disadvantage, generally the more points you get. You can also take some cool metagame disadvantages like enemies who show up during the game to ruin your day, bad reputations, or having dependents that you need to take care of between game sessions. And of course, once you start exploring more far out genres, you'll get a full range of exotic and supernatural advantages and disadvantages like the ability to use magic, the appetite for blood, armored scales, mind control, flying, fire breath. There are just so many options here to pick from. You really can create almost any character you want with this system. And it's because of all of those options is why the first advice I give to new GURPS players is to start with genres that don't use all of those options, as they can add a lot of complexity versus playing more typical humans. I always say start with low fantasy, Old West, horror, Indiana Jones pulp games, action, those sorts of genres. Because if you decide to play GURPS, giving players 1,000 points to spend and all the options in the book available, you're gonna run into trouble, I guarantee. Oh, so my character can turn invisible. He has mind control. He can do a 50-die burning attack, but only to people on Earth. He's also very vulnerable to fudge brownies. They just poison him. Oh, and he has the entire Russian government out to get him. Is this gonna be a problem? And this is the main issue with GURPS. GMs need to prep to run most genres. Some will be easy. If you tell your players you're going to play in a Game of Thrones fantasy world and only to pick the mundane traits and not to create anyone with high status, well, that's easy mode. Hard mode would be something like Star Wars, where you need to create multiple racial templates, like for things like Wookiees or Trandoshans or Ewoks. And then you have to think about how the Force works. Maybe allowing players a limited amount of points for things like telekinesis and mind control, but disallowing outright crazy powers like teleportation. The new Dark Sun relaunch from Wizard of the Coast is getting a lot of attention, and that's another good example of something that's quite possible but a little tricky to do in GURPS, because you have a lot of weird fantasy races, things like insect men you have to build. Then you have magic that acts a little weirdly because it drains the planet's environment. And then you have psionics to deal with too, and more. Well, that's all work in GURPS. And Dark Souls' level of difficulty would be trying to emulate a universe that allows unusual or unlimited power combinations. I would put the MCU in this category, where you have crazy high technology, aliens, superpowers, and magic all mixed together. It is possible, but GMs are going to end up with a lot of complexity and balance issues unless they're GURPS pros willing to really put in the work. But some players love that work. If you're an amateur game designer, it's a total blast. You can tinker and fine-tune so much, and there's nothing that you can't make work reasonably well with just this book. You can steal tons of stuff from other game systems and port them into GURPS with nothing but your time. And the fan community is there for it. Most of the discussions about GURPS are how to model a certain ability, how to replicate a magic system from a book or movie, or what the stats are of a certain gun. GURPS fans will be the first to tell you that GURPS isn't really an RPG, it's an RPG toolkit, but I've never liked that analogy because while it is a toolkit, it's a toolkit to create a GURPS game, so I see it more like a Lego set. You can make whatever you want, put the pieces together however you want, but you're still gonna have a Lego toy when you're done. And also like Lego, you can spend hundreds of dollars to buy more blocks to keep building. And as a result of GURPS's appeal to tinkerers, you'll find fewer discussions in the community on how to run great games or session reports or other topics that fuel other game systems. But it is a solid community, and you'll find fan sites with all of the D&D monsters ported to GURPS, new spells, new guns and equipment, and ports of people's favorite licensed worlds with unofficial supplements for things like Star Trek, Star Wars, Warhammer, Aliens, and lots more. Newer players should also be warned that there are very few published adventures for GURPS. Some of this is just practical. When your game system can do anything, how do you create an adventure that your players will want? Even with decades and decades of publications, there are probably less than 5 official adventures per genre. Fortunately, older adventures for 3rd edition still work fine, and I've created over 30 free GURPS adventures that you can download on oneshotadventures.com, which are expressly designed to help new GMs with the system with pre-generated characters, handouts, and VTT assets. Check the link in the description below. I'll also point out that thanks to that highly technical, passionate fan community, GURPS Game Aid VTT support is top-notch. It also has a free character creator, GCS. Neither one will win any awards for visual layout, but they're very, very functional, constantly getting updates, and are well supported by the community. So what does this new edition add? Like I said, the biggest update is the single book, new layout, new art. Although while the art is better than the previous version, I still don't think it's up to date compared to other newer RPGs. And because so little of the text has been altered, it still bears the same problem that 4th edition has always had, which is that it reads very much like a technical manual. It's not as breezy and fun to read as previous editions. It's fine if you know the game and just want to look up rules, but it is more difficult if you're newer or don't know the game so well. And because Steve Jackson Games maintained the page numbers between the two versions, there's no room here for badly needed upfront sections like a few pages of common hero templates, or how to think about creating a skill list for your player group, or where certain rules are probably too detailed for most games. That's just not here in this version. Wish it was, but again, that's probably would need to wait for a 5th edition. But Steve Jackson Games never promised this new version would do any of that. It's not meant to be a game for beginners any more than 4th edition was. In theory, that's what the free GURPS Lite would do, but there's no sign yet that it's getting its own revision anytime soon. Hopefully it does, because I think it's the badly needed bridge between this full 600 plus page GURPS book and something new players might want to just download and try. Okay, but back to the new stuff. Fourth Edition Revised includes 4 new addendums that bring together the best rules created over the last 2 decades. So let's go through each one. Addendum 1 is all about advantages, mostly introducing new ones that are highly useful for most campaigns. So you get things like Heroic Archer, which basically lets you create Legolas, damage resistance for superheroes that just cuts damage down when you take it, and one of my favorites, Jack of all trades, which lets characters succeed more often when they don't have a skill. There's also new perks, minor advantages, although this is where the first contradiction really happens in this new book. They fix offhand weapon training, using weapons like in your left hand. This was wildly overcosted in the main text. It's been that way for years, but in fixing it in this addendum, GMs now get 2 versions in the book, which is potentially confusing. There's a better rule here in the addendum, pasted in an awkward place while it still leaves the old rule intact. I just don't love that. There's also some new perks, enhancements, and limitations for powers, and new techniques. Overall, I give this addendum a solid B+, because it does contain a lot of useful things that you commonly see in GURPS since the 4th edition was created. It would have been nice to see some of the advantages in GURPS Powers make an appearance here, like the ability to create objects out of nothingness, but I see why they were just left in GURPS Powers, because those would have taken up a lot more page count. Overall, this addendum's well done. Addendum 2 contains rules extensions. There's 5 pages here dedicated to handling patrons and ranks better. Previously, it was left up mostly to the GM on what would happen if a character had paid points to be a captain in the army, or a first officer on a starship, or a member of the FBI. Now there's lots of guidance here, including rules for getting assistance with options like getting bailed out of jail, being lent new gear for a mission, or calling in the cavalry when everything's gone bad. It's probably too much for most games, but it's a welcome addition given how many games have PCs as members of a larger organization. There's also a page here for unified equipment options, like how to create rugged gear or visually impressive items. Again, this is useful as it impacts most games. It also fixes another problematic advantage, signature gear, an advantage that gave you a particular protected item in a game. I think Indiana Jones's fedora, which was always overcosted and a little weird in the core rules. So again, it's fixed, but now you have 2 versions in the book to pick from, which I just don't love. So overall, I think this chapter is fine. The patron and rank rules are useful, if not a little bit overwritten. I really wish they had figured out how to get the chase rules from GURPS Action into this chapter. I would have even given up on some of those iconic characters that are really close by in the book. I don't think we need all of those. But as it is, it's pretty good, so I'll give this a B-. Addendum 3 runs only 1 page, and it includes new hit locations. So if you always wanted to target your opponent's ears, jaws, or spine, well, have fun. I tend not to use that much detail in my games, so I could take or leave this. I'll give this a C+. I think this just could have stayed in GURPS Martial Arts, but you combat grognards, have fun with that. Addendum 4 has a lot of rules expansions and clarifications and simplifications. It starts with talking about task resolution, how to handle things like a spell going off a room full of dozens of goblins without having to roll against each one to resist the spell.
Oh, goblin number 5, did you make your health roll by 3 or more? Oh, you didn't, then you're asleep. Oh, goblin number 14, what about you? Oh, you did. Oh, you're awake. Arrow to the face here, boys. Hold on, 5 more goblins to go through.
It also improves influence skill so that they're not so binary. You see, in standard GURPS, if you make a sex appeal or diplomacy roll, you always get a good reaction, not better or worse. But now, if you make a great roll, well, you can do better. There's also more extra effort in combat options where players can spend fatigue points to move faster in battle or recover faster if they're using a big unbalanced weapon like a two-handed axe. I tend not to use extra effort in combat rules since I think they generally slow down the combats. I don't know, I'm always on the fence with that. Let me know what you think in the comments below, whether you like them. But these are solid options to let GURPS break free from some of its realism. There's also updated, more conservative hiking and vision and lighting rules, which I normally wouldn't even mention, but this hysterically addresses some monster, years-long threads on the Steve Jackson Games forums that have, I don't know, like 1,000 comments, so well done putting a stake in that. There's also rules for stress and derangement, which let you recreate the kind of slow burn sanity loss that pops up in so many horror games like Call of Cthulhu. I always use those for horror games. You totally should too. There's also new combat maneuvers, things like defensive attacks, and also all-out concentration, which is one of my favorite new options, which finally lets wizards and psionicists get bonuses to their mystic abilities in exchange for giving up their ability to defend on their turn. There's more. There's also a rule that gives GMs more realistic rules for dodging gunfire. In regular GURPS, you can dodge bullets pretty much as easily as you can arrows or sword blows, but with these rules, it's much, much harder. Now, I find guns are already deadly enough in GURPS, and taking away players' defenses against them would probably end up with a lot of my players really angry at me, so I'm not going to use these, but again, they're there for GMs who want more gritty realism. This addendum also brings in the range bands from GURPS Action. Thank God I love range bands. It simplifies all of those granular range modifiers down to just a handful, like most RPGs do these days. I almost always use these. They're just so much easier, especially if you're running Theater of the Mind or you don't want to force your players to like count out hex spaces on the board to see if they're 13 yards away or 16 yards away. And this addendum also introduces the bad rules. That's basic abstract difficulty system. I don't know why they made up a complicated acronym for that, but it basically boils down for guidance for GMs to hand wave away all of GURPS's many penalties. So for example, if your players are entering the inner part of the Death Star, the GM can say, all right, the bad number is -5. Everything here is going to be -5. The locks are harder to pick. The guards are going to be more likely to hear you being stealthy around the Death Star. And this is just a nice tool for newer GMs to kind of simplify all those modifiers that I talked about previously. There's also rules for simplifying handling consumables like ammo and arrows. Just the combination of GM guidance, abstracted and simpler rules for more complex GURPS aspects makes this addendum the best of the four. I really like this addendum. I almost think it gives us a little bit of a sneak peek into what GURPS 5th edition would be like. So I give this an A. So in the end, I think GURPS 4th edition Revised is a solid product, but I will fully admit that it neither addresses GURPS's flaws nor dramatically modernizes it. It does exactly what it said it was going to do. It's the same game it's been for the last 2 decades, but this is objectively a better product than the previous incarnation. If you already own GURPS 4th edition and many of its supplements, I don't think you need to rush out and get this. But if you like the idea of a single book that's far easier to read and reference, then it's probably worth a purchase. Like I said at the top, I am biased towards GURPS. I've been playing it since the 80s, but I'm also one of its biggest critics on how it's missed some opportunities to grow, especially as RPGs have experienced a resurgence in the last 5 years. While I don't think GURPS 4th edition Revised will dramatically change its trajectory, I'm glad to see Steve Jackson Games offering something new for its fans. This is material, and I'm really hoping it's successful enough to warrant revisions or even second editions of some of the older GURPS mainstay supplements, especially GURPS Magic, which is also 20 years old and creaky as hell with a lot of the rules not even matching 4th edition, and GURPS Ultra-Tech, which for a book about future technology, well, that should be updated more than once every 2 decades. If you've gotten a chance to check out this new version of GURPS, let me know in the comments below what you think. And remember, if you're interested in trying GURPS out, go grab one of my many free adventures from my website, which has dozens of options from lots of genres, from fantasy and cyberpunk to the Wild West and modern horror and so much more. There's a link in the description below. Until next time, I'm JC, and may all your rolls be huge piercing damage to the skull.